I'm legit scared of this.
This is a bit like... And now it stopped. No, it didn't.
What's happening? Wait. Okay, no, let's
change.
Yeah, let's change.
Free.
Yeah. Let's change. That's a good idea. Today we have Panu.
Hello.
And he is going to be sharing with us what's wrong with design thinking.
Right.
So Panu, you're from Nordkapp. What does Nordkapp do?
Nordkapp is a design agency located mostly here in Helsinki, but we have an office also in Amsterdam.
Okay.
And we concentrate in designing digital stuff, digital services and digital products, and also all the related concepts and branding and strategies related to those.
I see. Okay. It's interesting. So do you use design thinking in your work?
We do apply it, I think. The terms are sometimes a bit like, mixed related to, like, some call it design thinking, and then there's sort of like service design is related to that. Mm-hmm. Human-centered design is overlapping it, and interaction design. And people seem to have a different, they talk about quite similar things, but a bit of different flavors.
I see.
We mostly try to keep out of this kind of like discussion of the semantics that what is what and what does each term mean, because it's actually not terribly productive. As long as we can deliver good stuff, that will be good.
I see. Yeah, I guess you don't label it, you just do it.
Yeah, it's much more sort of useful and productive that way rather than finding labels.
True.
But I've been thinking of this design thinking quite a lot, because there are so nice good framework, and it has gained popularity lately. But it has some deficiencies, I think, and I think that's one of the topics that we could be discussing today.
Okay. Actually, so let's track back a bit, and perhaps you could give us a 411 on like what design thinking is, or what design is. How do you apply it in your work?
Design in general, that's a really big question. Of course, design is like certain kind of like attitude and mentality and for solving difficult problems.
Yep.
However, then design thinking, it is sort of a relatively new branch of design. We can go there. It's sort of like mostly branded by, I think, IDEO. It's a kind of framework that has many aspects. It has sort of like a process aspect. It has aspects related to organizational culture and how to do things, and skills. It has, of course, lots of things to do with methods and processes. If you look at the descriptions of, can we actually run here? Probably we shouldn't turn here. That happens. So if you look at the different kind of like short descriptions of design thinking, it seems to be concentrating. Well, the framework is based on the idea that you innovate in areas related to new technology. New business, and also something that fits the human. And I think this human part is the sort of the key, where design thinking is really concentrating on that. Everything like the business and the technology development is sort of like serving the needs for human beings. And it is design thinking is a methodology and framework where we try to find solutions that are good for people, it's good for business, and good for new technology. Related to that, there are also processes, and if we look at any of the descriptions of design thinking, they typically are describing design thinking process as a series of steps where you start with that you call it
Empathy,
empathy, like
Yeah.
empathizing with
Like the
with the
user.
users and so forth.
Yeah.
And then you move on to defining what the problem is, and then ideating solutions and designing solutions. We actually go left here, and then prototyping, and then testing it.
Yep.
So they are quite often written out this kind of like big blocks of activities. And now, if we compare this process model that is usually used to describe how design thinking works, it resembles the old way how the software design used to be, and they actually called it the waterfall model. You have to first do one step and one phase, and then you move on to the next phase when you have finished that, and then the third phase and so forth. And software actually has more or less completely abandoned this model maybe 10 years ago and moved on to agile.
Okay.
So they don't actually describe the processes in this kind of like large phases, but rather in sprints. So the smaller packages where you actually can do all of that, those activities in any of those phases. Now, the question is, of course, is that really the best model now for design? That we still draw the kind of like the process for design thinking in this kind of phases. And I know, of course, if you have seen those charts, they always are referring then that, well, of course you can iterate and you can come back to the previous phase and so forth. But in a big picture, all the visualizations of the process are quite rigid and quite waterfally. And I think that's one of the big challenges that design thinking currently has. People who know what they are doing and are used to design, they actually sort of can go beyond that they don't follow that kind of rigid model.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, when, for example, if you go and Google around about this process, you will always find this model. So it seems to be that even unintentionally, this model that has been drawn out like that is sort of permeating the whole design industry like that, and it evidently will then have an impact on how people do design and how they formulate the work that they do. Especially, I'm sort of really sort of worried about that. If that model is the only model that the students will see, and they will learn the model, they will already, like, you know, quite in the beginning, they will start to adopt any project or process that they do to that kind of model. And that is completely wrong.
Well, I guess, for example, in IDBM, we have students from design background, from engineering, from business. Typically, when we try to teach design to non-designers, that's how people do it. So, do you think that that's a good crash course for them to start adopting design, or should there be another method?
Because I'm not happy with the model, just like in software. So like for in software, you wouldn't teach software like the waterfall model. And I don't really think that we should teach design either with that kind of model. Everybody kind of understands that model is not perfect, that kind of model, and it should be, and you shouldn't actually follow it literally like that. But the problem really is that model is not going to go away unless we find some other models that will replace it. So therefore there's the one thing that I've been trying to do is to sort of like find visualizations for a model that is not like that has fixed the problems there.
So Panu has also been writing blog posts on this topic, and one of the things that you mentioned in your blog post was design arenas. So the way we design, sometimes like from a designer, like applied arts point of view, or someone who's from a business point of view, might have a different take on design thinking, or we may focus on different things. So someone from tech might focus on evaluations, or like what are the criteria in the output. Like, what are you actually designing?
Yes.
So, how do you think this would help people navigate around design thinking, or how the process should be like? What do you think is something that we could use potentially? Like, I see that you also created a design arena canvas. So, how does DAC work for people who are new to this?
Maybe the design arena canvas needs a bit of like background first, sort of like if we think of like design thinking process and design in general, it's sort of like intended to solve wicked problems, but actually quite complex in their nature. So I actually recommend if you haven't read the original work and articles by Rittel and Weber about the wicked problems. I think they're from like 1973. So anyway, so if you haven't read the original articles by Rittel where he defines the wicked problems, I think it's a really nice read, even though it's quite old. And it's in the original context was like social and urban planning. And naturally the problems are there quite complex. Some of the learnings from there is that if you when you start sort of like a design process, it's actually really difficult in that kind of problems even define that what you are doing, what is the problem that you are going to solve and for whom it is. And then when you start developing the solutions, you actually, at the end, when you get to the solutions, you really don't know whether you have finally solved the problem. You might have sort of like hypothesis that yes, this will be actually really good, but you don't know until you have put that in the practice and seen the real impact, the impact that you intended, but also naturally there will be impact that you unexpected consequences that you didn't expect. So, and I think it's sort of like interesting to think there through that it's actually when you are doing design, you don't have this kind of like defined problem in the beginning and you don't have a solution at the end. But rather it seems that when you start designing something, you have some hypothesis about different aspects of the thing that you're designing. So you have a hypothesis that like who is this for example? And you have hypothesis that what is the purpose for this like the target groups and stakeholders. You might have already some ideas that I think this is very typical for designers. They always have ideas and they have like solution proposals in their mind already when they start working on something. And they might have some like tests and earlier results of like that the earlier versions of the product didn't work so well and we would like to improve it in this and this way. So already in the beginning of the process you already have kind of like hypothesis and elements of the solution. And at the end, you just sort of like during the process, you sort of like you make those hypotheses more concrete. You create, the artifacts and the solutions in increasing fidelity. You start to understand much more about the people who are designing for, and you also sort of like might much better understand the purposes that you are designing them for. So in a way, it seems that the starting point and the problem and the solution at the end are like the structure of them is very similar. They are not like completely different things. And now for this purpose we have developed it's actually not there, right? It's actually not So for this purpose we have developed the canvas. So the canvas is actually consisting of design arenas, which are the purposes and the beneficiaries, who is it for, the artifacts themselves, so the practical and concrete things that you develop, or digital things, and all the actual results, and all the evaluations and criteria that you use for verifying that does this sort of like equation work. So is this solution an artifact good for the beneficiaries, and does it fulfill the purpose? Excuse me. So the process there is actually sort of like you increase the confidence in all of these design arenas. And then the point of the design arena canvas is that it's sort of like quite a simple canvas. And I must here stress that the canvas is actually, excuse me, the canvas is just a template. It's not a method and it's not a process, it's just a template. So you use that template and the methods that you prefer and are useful, and the processes that we can talk about the process maybe later. in order to fill that canvas in, so that in the beginning you sort of list your assumption in there, and during the process you evolve all of those canvases towards the final solution. So that canvas is actually there in your design process from the day one, and it will be there at the end when you're finished, and it's sort of a common reference point throughout the process, that you can always see where you are, and you can see always what your confidence level is in whether you understand your users, the customers, and whether you understand the purpose and the vision what you're building, and you understand and you're really confident that you can actually build the artifacts that you have in there. And the big difference here compared to this kind of rigid design thinking model is that you can do any of the activities in a certain sprint. You don't need to wait until the end that you can start to do consumer validations, for example. You can validate with really early prototypes. You can do a brainstorming session about the ideas for the project or for the artifacts, even the first or second day of the project. You don't need to wait until the third phase. If that is sort of relevant, then it helps you to understand the problem. So for each of these sprints, you have to sort of like sit down and think that, okay, what are the most important things and question marks that we need to do right now? Or, do we know enough that we can already sort of like start sketching some kind of alternatives and prototypes of the concepts? Or it sort of leaves quite a lot of freedom and also of naturally therefore responsibility on the designers and the whole team to decide that what are the most important things that you should be working on next. And I think it's sort of now related to, I think you had the question there about the team, that the team might be composing of different things. Now, if we look at the old model, rigid model, where you start with empathizing, and then it sort of like would kind of invite everybody to do empathizing at the same time.
Yeah.
So that you couldn't, that's actually sort of like, it doesn't support you to split the team according to their strengths. So it could be that at the same time it makes a lot of sense, for example, some people to go and interview some kind of potential target users, and some people might actually want at the same time to do some kind of like technical analysis already. If you think that some of the technology poses such a big risk for the whole project that you actually would rather want to spend time on it relatively early. So it's also like supporting that kind of like the whole team is like in the canvas they see the whole process, or the sort of like the status of the process there, and and then they can together decide that even despite of the backgrounds and skills of people, that what would be the most useful thing to do for that group. Of course, considering what their skills and resources and schedules and so forth are. So, of course, that must be taken into account.
So, usually for example, a design project that has people from different disciplines, I think the empathizing phase typically helps, or is meant for everybody to kind of be on the same page.
Yes.
Do you think that using the DAC or having people work according to their own strengths, that's still possible?
Yeah, I think it doesn't actually take any sort of like, it doesn't depend on, the team can decide whichever makes sense for them. I of course encourage that everybody would participate, for example, empathizing, that they would meet the real users so that they will like first-hand see them.
Yeah.
And so forth, and well, maybe then if you're thinking of like some kind of like software architecture, it probably doesn't make sense. If a humanist starts to make sort of like any analysis on that, they probably would not be terribly useful. But yeah, it's sort of like once again, it depends on it leaves the responsibility actually then to the team to decide how they want to do that. I think the good thing with the canvas is that whenever it's sort of like shared, and I recommend making it big and reserving a room for it so that you can keep stuff there, that everybody's still like all the time seeing what the other sort of like people are doing in the same project. So they cannot like avoid it just like I do my own thing, but they always sort of like come back to the same board and analyze the sort of like the interlinks between the board. So at the same time, when it's sort of a tool for evolving the problem space to the solution space, it's also sort of very much this kind of like shared communication tool.
So I think earlier in the car we were discussing how usually design thinking processes have quite design-oriented vocabularies. And that's why we decided to go through a bit of how like the DAC canvas has quite generic vocabularies like purpose and artifacts.
Yeah, as you see here, sort of like the words, they always have come with a baggage. So they have some semantic meaning or traditional meaning that in certain design traditions they have been used in a certain way. So in a way, in this canvas, we have tried to avoid using the words that have a certain kind of a meaning in certain context. For example, here we have the beneficiaries, which is you don't hear that word, I think, too often. We could have maybe users or stakeholders, but they all come from they have some kind of a hidden meaning behind it, and some people understand users differently. Some people say that it's really limited, and some people say that it's fine, and now some people say that it's actually really good. So we wanted to avoid a bit of that kind of discussion. So the semantics there is not that important. It's sort of like, it just needs to be broad enough and descriptive enough. The beneficiaries here actually sort of, we could even sort of like expand it a bit more, because sometimes the end results of the designs are not necessarily beneficial. They could be also like the opposite. So we need to include there also like maleficiaries, and so we need to understand these quite general terms. In a similar way, I think the artifacts, we could have here like objects, but objects often refer to physical stuff.
Yeah.
It could be something digital, it could be something quite intangible like instructions or like guidelines, it could be clothing, it could be almost anything. It's just sort of descriptive name that encompasses all the different kind of like concrete outcomes out of those processes.
And I understand that the DAC is not supposed to be like a one-off kind of thing. You're supposed to kind of iterations of the canvas.
Yes, I think that's really, really important aspect of it. So it's actually quite seldom that you start any project in a sort of like completely from scratch. Okay, we assume that sometimes, for example, if you have a new project team, you sort of need to build up this first with the kind of like your assumptions of what you think and what your sort of like questions are. But when you sort of then evolve that to a certain point where you say that, okay, now it's enough, it's sort of finished, you have an artifact that you can actually maybe release or put out there in the wild. In that, it's actually really interesting to see that the artifact is only one part of the end result of the process. You also then have all the rest of the design arenas here descriptive. So you have a really sort of, you understand what the purpose is for that thing that you're releasing. You understand really a lot like who is it for. And this information is often like equally important than the artifact itself. Sometimes the artifact can be really simple, but the understanding that you create might be even more valuable. And this canvas of many projects, they have different phases. So you release maybe an alpha, beta version of, for example, a digital product. Of course, you never throw this away, but for the next release, you will actually continue evolving it. So this will actually never go away in a way. So you keep evolving the same if you're talking about the same problem space or the same solution.
But usually for example, when you start like a design project, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have an idea already, sometimes you don't. But typically in the design thinking process, you're kind of expected to go and do your research first.
Yes.
And in this case, you might not do that. In this case, you might already be building on something that exists.
Right. I think it's actually even more common in the real world design cases that you have already some like existing systems that you need to start build on. You have, you are designing a new ballpoint pen or whatever. The world is full of ballpoint pens. You have reference products and you know them, and sort of like you can already start from that. You never it's very rare that you start from like
Zero.
nothing.
Yeah.
So you can already, in that case, this is a very simplest example, but in ballpoint pen, you can already start to figuring out that, okay, these are the technologies, these are the products we already have, and now our sort of mission is to do maybe the next version that fits better for a certain user group, like left-handed people or something like that. So in any case, you very rarely start from like none of, there is always something in all of these areas.
That's true. And typically when you do projects like that, you have kind of like you mentioned, like a reference point. And what if you don't have like access to, for example, the actual users, the end users?
That can happen in real world as well. Sometimes you don't have access to some of the resources that you need. Then I guess you don't have much choice. Then you have to rely on, you do this, like you evolve these arenas to be as confident as you can be, and the rest you of course then you need to take some risk, and that's something that sometimes you just can't avoid. But I think it's really good that you already like you recognize that risk. You know that we are now running a bit of risk, and when we put stuff out there, it might fail in this and this aspect. But especially nowadays with the digital products, the culture is that you actually evolve the product as well, and sort of you can try out things also out there, and then evolve them when you have already released them. So you can actually sort of get then like this kind of like after the fact, you can get the information and verification whether your hypothesis was right or wrong. This is of course something that is highly sort of encouraged in current like lean UX and lean startup thinking. That get something out and then get the feedback. So don't wait for too long, release earlier, which fits this model I think quite nicely.
And typically, because as an experienced designer, you have certain like assumptions, and you know that you can make assumptions. But what if you're completely new to this? Is there like trick to getting around it?
Yes, I think here is actually sort of like maybe a little bit of a story around this. Is that I used to work at Nokia at one point with industrial designers, and industrial designers come from this kind of applied arts background and culture, and it's actually very different from this kind of a human-centered design, which is quite, let's say that in human-centered design you tend to sort of like, at least the tradition is that you actually want to analyze quite a lot before you start creating solutions. But it's a kind of analytical model. But in this like applied arts, you don't do that. When I was working with industrial design, I was actually quite shocked at how can you start sketching stuff without knowing anything about the other stuff? And I was thinking that this is completely wrong until I realized that no, it's not wrong. It's just a different tradition, and it has really some strong points of it. So, for example, industrial designers can take a theme of sketching, let's say, a ballpoint pen for the left-handed people. And they immediately go into this kind of like ideation and sketching phase without this kind of rigorous analysis. And it's only like after that, when they look at what they have, the sort of the variety of the ideas that could be really wacky and could be quite conservative, and then they sort of like have a critique. And the human-centered design tradition doesn't really have the tradition of critique. And in the critique, they analyze the ideas and see that, well, this is good for these and these people because of X, Y, and Z. So they kind of really quickly get into this kind of like practice of creating the framework for this kind of like the problem space. So after this kind of like brainstorming workshop, they actually can figure out a lot of things they create the beneficiary, the hypothesis for the beneficiaries immediately, and also the purposes. So, for example, this idea might be really good for left-handed pen who are missing the little finger or anything, something like that. So they already like immediately start filling in stuff without going through this kind of like long analytical phase. It's a different approach, but I think it's actually really, really efficient in some aspects. And if we think of somebody who cannot fill anything in this, I would actually recommend them just to do a brainstorm session. Try to brainstorm as many ideas as possible and then see that, okay, what are they good for? And that gives you all the kind of ideas how to fill in this stuff. One caveat, of course, is that don't fall in love with those first ideas, because you might later find out that your assumptions were wrong. But that's of course, I think, should be in the heart of designer's profession anyway. That's your mentality. Your first hypothesis is probably going to be slightly off.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I guess while using that kind of model, it gives the flexibility for people from different disciplines to start filling out this canvas as well.
Correct. That is completely right. And especially if you have people from different backgrounds, they can sort of like see the first brainstorms and ideas from their own perspective, and then they can sort of like articulate why they think some kind of idea is good. That this idea is really good because we have the technology to implement it. So like, well, excellent. That's one criteria that we can put down in the artifacts. This is difficult because we don't really have that technology yet, and the integration will be really even tech guys can then participate really nicely in sort of like filling in the stuff for the hypothesis for the canvas.
Yeah. Well, I guess that really works for IDBM, since we have people from all different kinds of backgrounds, and it really helps to have a different approach than the standard like ideal design thinking method. And I think it's been really insightful today. So thank you so much for being on this.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure.